Bum bum bum, literature gets a look. Legs talk about books. Greetings and welcome to Legs Talk About Books, the monthly literature podcast where we talk about books. I'm your host, Hardleg Joe. Joining me today, Mr. CB Radio, my common compatriot.
CB.
You're just gonna ruin that right off the bat. I tried to be so fancy. I tried to put on my literary voice, and you're like, nah.
I thought you were f***ing around on that one, because that one's very different. And you usually like to keep your aesthetic pretty solid on that.
No, that's gonna be the intro now. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you like it all. We need to have a little levity. I don't know, this book is kind of levitous. It has some, like, humor. It's more humorous than Gods and Generals was.
Okay, Gods and Generals is a legit war in the nitty-gritty point, and this book is only got like a fraction of that, and the rest of it's just...
Yeah, but it's still a very serious book. It's still about a very serious topic and about war. It just treats it with some levity at times. It tries to make it more digestible. But yeah, I guess we'll get into that. This month's book, if you couldn't tell by the title or whatever, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut.
You may have heard of it.
A literary classic, one of my personal favorites. Something that you had not read before.
I had not, no.
Yeah, I didn't read it in school or anything. I know a lot of people do read this in school. I picked it up sometime afterwards. I had a girlfriend at the time who recommended it to me. I tried it out, and I really enjoyed it. And we were trying to struggle for something this month because everything was closed for COVID-19. It was hard to get a hold of new books. So I was like, I have this on the shelf. You want to just reread this? There's a lot of stuff we could talk about. There's a lot of things to unpack. So I figured we'd try this out. So yeah, if you're unfamiliar with the podcast, if you're unfamiliar with our format, we don't really go plot point by plot point. We're not going to summarize the book. We're going to give our spoiler-free thoughts beforehand, in case you haven't read the book. And then we're just going to go into discussion about the themes and about the narrative and stuff like that. We're going to assume that either you've already read the book or you're just not going to read the book. Maybe you'll read it after the fact? I don't know. I feel like hearing a discussion about it usually is like, I've heard a discussion, I don't need to read it anymore.
On certain things, there are certain books that are too dense for you to be like, yeah, I've read every part of it by hearing this podcast talk.
Yeah. You're never, especially with this one, this is pretty short. I would highly recommend you read this personally. Again, this is one of my favorite books. And that, what was it, the audiobook is 5 hours long?
Yeah, it's not a long book, even close.
It's something you can get through in like a day if you want to.
If you could.
Your experience, you did not like the audiobook narrator at all.
No, and he was rather, it was James Franco.
Yeah, James Franco does it, and I remember you played a short portion for me, and it is just very, like, monotone, very droning. You can kind of tell that, like, when he doesn't have a character to act, when he's just, like, reading prose, he doesn't really know what to do with his voice necessarily.
I felt that, but I also felt that it was much more like he was emphasizing the wrong point of the story by being very, like you said, monotone and lax, and just the lackadaisical version of this.
Yeah. So, I would recommend this, the audiobook. You can also listen to it free on YouTube. There's several people who have done it. One in particular I looked up because I was trying to get it for the book club people on the Discord. I listened to the first, 10-15 minutes of it. It's a little...
rough?
Amateur, I guess, would be a better word.
Rough sounds nice.
Rough makes it sound like he's missing over stuff, but he's not. He just sounds like a younger guy, and it maybe doesn't have the kind of weight. But looking at all the comments and everything, people were like, this started out sounding a little amateurish, but by the end, it became really endearing. It's apparent that the person who read it, cared about the text and wanted to do it justice. And it seemed like a really good... So I would suggest looking that up on YouTube. There's a couple other people. There's a guy who does it in a really deep voice. Yeah. It's a little more rough, I would say. The audio quality's not as good. Either way, you can get this book pretty easily. And I don't know, I guess that's kind of piracy if you're just listening to the book on YouTube and not going through the author, but honestly, the author's dead. The book was written in, the 50s?
Yeah.
Let me look at this.
And if you do love the book, do support the author. Buy. I know that if the author is dead, that doesn't really matter as much, but they do have a family that they've left behind.
Yeah, 1969. I mean, obviously, yeah, if you like the book and you really want to support the family or whatever, buy it. I mean, I bought the book, but I bought this at a secondhand shop, so it's not like Kurt Vonnegut's family got any money for that. It was someone else's.
You don't know that. It could be run by a relative of Kurt Vonnegut.
You never know. But yeah, at this point, I feel like it's a classic. It's very apparent that this is a story that Kurt wanted to tell, that was very important to him, that had a message. I feel like he would appreciate that it's getting out necessary. Like, he's more interested in people hearing the story than in getting money for it.
It's a very passion-filled story.
In fact, he actually, there's an anecdote where he specifically kind of feels weird about getting paid money for it.
Yeah.
Which I guess, yeah, it's not really it's not really a spoiler to say that, like, this story is about the bombing of Dresden.
Oh, definitely not a spoiler on
That's
that
what
one.
they say right at the beginning. And there's I'm not going to have the exact quote here, but I remember hearing this quote from him where he was like, "The bombing of Dresden was such a useless thing that the only person who benefited from it was me." He's like, "I wrote this book and I made $2 for every person who died."
Damn.
And it's just, yeah, kind of a little bit of a guilty,
morbid.
Yeah, a little morbid. But it kind of goes, like, so it goes.
I will give it one thing, though. It did have the most interesting beginning I've ever had to a kind of, I wouldn't say fantasy, but a stranger narrative book. Because it took literally the main character out of it and was just a narrative of how the book was made.
The first chapter is just the author literally telling you, like, about the book in sort of a rambly, interesting way. This whole book, it's really, to me, one of the things that makes it so interesting is how experimental it is. Especially considering it's, like, from the 70s. Like, maybe breaking the fourth wall these days is not... I mean, even breaking the fourth wall now in a book is a little bit odd, but doing it in such an overt way here and making it part of the narrative like he did, very, very interesting.
I feel like I actually would dispute the idea that it's an uncommon thing in literature these days, but that's a whole discussion for another day about how it is something that has permeated our culture in the sense that a lot of things decide to break down the actual, like, structural norms of stories.
I'm just trying to think of other, like, famous stories that start like that.
Well, it's not so much famous, but it is a thing that is, like I said, it's saturated in our culture.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where, like, again, this is a story that people read in school because it's highly recommended, but you look at the other stuff you read in school, like To Kill a Mockingbird, Lord of the Flies, A Raisin in the Sun...
Streetcar Named Desire.
Yeah, these are all very, very straightforward narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you could have something that goes so off the rails like that...
In the first 5 seconds, yeah.
Yeah, just immediately. And that's why I would recommend this so much, because when you look at art, there's actually a theory... I'll have to make a video about this at some point, where there's like four main objectives that art tries to do.
Mm-hmm.
It either needs to fill you with an emotion... like, convey an emotion. Escapist entertainment sort of falls into that, but not necessarily. So do, like, I guess romances are kind of escapist. Anything that sort of, like, pulls at your heartstrings, that makes you feel something.
Charges your emotions.
Yeah. There's making sort of, like, classic, beautiful art, something that stands the test of time, where you don't necessarily feel an emotion, but you look at it and you're just like, wow, that took so much skill, that took so much effort.
That portrait of an entire, like, Sunday morning that's made out of stippling.
Yeah, sort of like the Mona Lisa, where, like, the Mona Lisa doesn't make you feel anything. It doesn't make you, like, think about stuff. Yeah, some people. But for the most part, it's just, like, the craftsmanship is really good. Mm-hmm. Or, like, ancient sculptures and stuff like that, where you're just like, man, he made that out of marble.
The pyramid.
Yeah, the pyramids aren't necessarily made
they have a function, but
but the point is, okay, you got the pulling on the emotions, you've got the like classical art, you've got telling a message, having a story, trying to like make a point about something, and then you have like working the craft itself, like experimenting, trying to evolve what it's possible to do with the narrative.
Pet sounds.
Pet sounds to an extent. There's a lot of experimental stuff. A lot of it's not really popular. But it's sort of important to be in art to push what art can do. Mm-hmm. House of Leaves is a really good experimental book. But it's just one of those things where most art, whether it be movies, books, or whatever, it strives to do one thing, maybe two really well. And this is the only book I know that sort of like hits all four. It has elements of like, this stands the test of time. You read it, doesn't sound like something you would have written in the 50s.
Oh yeah, it definitely kind of feels out there.
Yeah, it's so out there and sort of disconnected that I feel like no matter what time you're in, you can understand it. It's timeless, but it also makes you feel things, but it also has a message about war, but it's also an experimental narrative with the way it's told.
Also, I want to say that there are several things that I'm going to be saying throughout this that make it sound like I don't really like this book or I don't see a value in it. There are things about it that I'm really impressed by. Way it conveys things, his language, that's the term I'm going for.
His choice of words.
Is very modern. And much more modern than books even around its time were being written in.
Like, you compare this to something like To Kill a Mockingbird, and you're like, holy shit, like, these were written, like, near the same time, like, late 60s or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this came out in 69, but he was working on it for a while.
Mockingbird's a weird one. Go for something more along the lines of, like, Streetcar Named Desire, or...
Yeah, or again, Raisin in the Sun of Mice and Men. But yeah, so that's just my point. Again, you didn't particularly like this book.
I did not entirely like this book.
But you can see that it has some merit to it.
Oh, I definitely see the merit in it, and I have said to you several times, or a couple times, that if they took out everything that isn't the war, that is based around, like, the war of it...
And the alien... Did you like the alien stuff?
I did not like the alien stuff.
Okay.
Anything that involved the war, I was just kind of like, this was, like... I was invested with the character. I was actually interested in what was going on.
It was all the time travel and the aliens and his life afterwards that kind of, like, disconnected you from it.
Yeah, it kind of made the character very unlikable to me, as well as it made the story kind of slog and feel very weird and just icky for me.
It's one of those things where I feel like the time travel, in addition to having a narrative sort of purpose to it, is almost made for people who have, like, difficulty reading books. Mm-hmm. It's almost like, that's why I think so many people can't enjoy this, because instead of just, like, listening to a war story for 40 minutes, it jumps around to all these different things. It's almost like made for people with ADD.
But admittedly, the story of Dresden is this very compellingly, fascinatingly, morbidly, terrifyingly, just so many lees.
Yeah.
A story that I kind of wish I knew more about it because of this book.
Yeah, I had no idea about Dresden. They don't talk about it in the history books, really. I mean, the history books do, but, like, I never learned about it in high school. I never learned about it in college, even when we were studying World War II. And, like, part of the reason for that is because, like I said at the beginning, Dresden served no purpose. It was bombed for seemingly no reason. It was like a massacre on, like, a huge scale. But it was done by the Americans on Germans, American and British bombers. And so it's one of those things where I think it doesn't get brought up partially because it was useless, but partly because it sort of ruins the narrative around World War II, that, like, we were the unambiguous good guys, and the Germans were the unambiguous bad guys. Except there's, like, a city the size of Cincinnati that had nothing to do with the war, that had nothing to do with anything, and we just bombed the shit out of it, like, back to the Stone Age. Like, utterly destroyed for pretty much no reason.
One of the most shocking moments, and I actually did rewind in this because I was also, like, working and listening to this, but he describes a water tower during this bombing that he finds, that he himself, not the main character of the story, found a bunch of schoolgirls in a water tower that attempted to hide in there, and it boiled them alive. And it's just this, my God...
Because it's one of those things, too, where, like, you see... I remember watching the bombings of, like, Iraq and stuff. Mm-hmm. On, like, they showed that on the news and everything when it happened. They're like, hey, we're shock and awe campaign or whatever. And when you see it from, like, the airplanes, when you see it from a distance, you just see these, like, little, like... Poofs, explosion. And it's hard to put into words, like, the terrifying, destructive ability of, like, bombs that size. And this, from someone who was, like, on the ground and everything... Which, yeah, we should mention, this isn't like, he didn't just write about Dresden. Kurt Vonnegut was in Dresden when it was bombed. That's, I guess, the spoilers for the... yeah, we'll go ahead and get into the spoiler territory now.
If you could put up a big... No, just kidding.
Big spoiler warning, you know, if you want to read this book, go ahead, because, again, I highly recommend it. Brandon, maybe not necessarily recommend it, but
I'd recommend 60% of it.
Okay.
Because it's, again... There is a large portion of it that isn't involving the war, but everything else about it, I'd be like...
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're saying, like, you know, you didn't enjoy it, but you're not upset that you had to read it.
Yes.
That would be a good thing. You're glad that you read it because you did learn a little something from it.
I am glad that I read it. There are parts of it that... This is the only audiobook that it took me 5 days to go through 5 hours of it.
Yeah.
But that's just because... Billy Pilgrim, the main character, I don't like him.
You don't like him?
I just don't like him.
But yeah, again, the point we were making, Kurt Vonnegut was in Dresden. The name of the title, Slaughterhouse-Five, was because that's where he and a bunch of American POWs were hiding. And for whatever reason, that slaughterhouse with its underground
bunker,
I don't know. It was like they didn't have like electronic freezers or whatever, so things were kept underground. You had to go pretty far down because it got really cold. And it was very stone walls, so that survived.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like they came out of Dresden and had like I think 100,000 people, and it was like a couple hundred that survived.
My God, it
just
the most terrifying thing I think I've heard in a book in a while. But
and
also, he does pop up 3 times in this book.
Yeah, that's the really weird thing, is because it's something that happened to him. This is biographical. All of this happened more or less, as it says, and I think that's the opening line of the story. But he's not the main character. He has a fictional main character, but that main character, like, is another POW with him. And every once in a while, he's like, and there I was, like, digging pits for corpses and stuff, or there I was, sick as a dog.
Yeah, one of the first parts you see him in the story is apparently he's shitting out his brains.
Yeah.
Which, again, I don't like this book as much as most, but I 100% respect a man who's like, I put myself in the story, and the first time you see me, I'm shitting my pants so bad because my brain is it's just like...
Yeah, it was, all the POWs had been on a train for like 2 weeks where they got like almost nothing to eat, and then they finally arrived at the camp, and the people who had been at the camp were like, hey, we're gonna make you a feast. It was a bunch of British POWs who had been there for like, since the start of the war.
All officers, if anybody here is military, you know that they're a little bit of...
They were all officers, and what was it? They said for whatever reason, due to a clinical error, they got 10 rations for each person instead of 1.
Oh, yeah.
So they had excess food, and they traded it with the guards for other food, and they were all very polite British gentlemen, so they got extra stuff. So when the American POWs arrived, they, like, baked them a feast, and of course, if you don't eat anything for, like, a week, and then you eat a feast... You're just like, oh, your body can't handle it. You almost go to, like, shock.
There's contractions with the stomach. It's a thing. But, yeah like...
So then Billy goes out, and it's just every POW is, like, rolling over in the ground, just, like, shitting their pants.
I like that he talks about going to the latrine, which is bathroom, if anybody wants to go for that word. And it says, please keep the latrine clean. And it's just a row of American soldiers just like...
Yeah, that was the first line by the author since the title was like, there it goes, my brain. I've shit my brains. Every last bit has come out.
And then you just hear a break and it's like, that was me. I was that man.
My brain's gone into a toilet out in a POW camp. And that should give you an idea of, like, the tone of this book. Again, it's because it's a super serious thing. You talk about Dresden, it's like, holy shit, holy fuck.
Mm-hmm.
But he manages to make it digestible. It's not like so many other, like, tragic stories where it feels like they're just hammering it home over and over again. This is really one of those books where, like, I never felt sad while reading it. It's one of the interesting things that the book does, because... taken as its individual parts, none of it, like, really makes you feel a whole lot, but it's after you sit down and, like, think about it that all of it sort of hits you.
Yeah.
Like, I remember being in bed, like, hours after I had read this and just sort of, like, thinking about the war in Dresden and what it was like and just kind of tearing up a little bit. There's something they do where every time someone dies, they say, so it goes.
Even on some ridiculous ones.
Yeah, they do kind of ridiculous, like the TV died, so it goes.
My favorite one is they've deloused him, so all of, like, the tiny microbes on there have died. So it goes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those recurring, like, almost jokes. It's almost like a gag. Until at the end you sit down and you're like, how many times did they say it? Like, how many hundreds of people died in this book that were glossed over? And then you think about it and you're like, oh my god, everything was so horrible. And one of the fun trivia fact, they made a movie about this, and the movie never says "so it goes" once.
Yeah, it was dead on arrival.
Yeah, so it goes. That's one of those funny things. Apparently the movie's really good. I've never seen it. The author really liked it. My dad really liked it. There's talk of remaking it, apparently.
Huh.
I'm not sure. I don't know. This feels really weird to make a movie out of it because the narrative's so disjointed and everything.
It's not a perfect book by any means, because certain things about it, even from like a non-objective point of view, is kind of annoying because he doesn't really describe the Tralfamadorians, the aliens of this one, too exceptionally well.
Yeah.
And
as a sci-fi story, it's kind of lacking, which you could argue that like maybe it's not meant to be a sci-fi story, but
well, I mean,
it has elephants.
It made me, yeah.
I mean elements, but you know what I meant.
Okay, I thought you said I was like, did I forget an elephant in this store? There are weirder things.
It has elements of sci-fi.
But that did make some parts of it difficult, other than the obvious other parts. It's the idea of like, what do these creatures that he's being abducted by look like? And like, I don't have a full picture here. Yeah,
they talk about how they have like, they're basically a hand with an eye on the palm. Mm-hmm. But I've heard people talk about like, oh yeah, they walk on their fingers, or they look like toilet plungers, or like I see like all these different interpretations of what a Tralfamadorian looks like.
I honestly, until they started talking about how the hands closing was their eyes, was like that. To me, it was like a plunger with feet that had googly eyes on the front.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if they have. I don't know. They're weird because the way they perceive time is also different, because they said to them a human looks like a mile-long centipede with baby feet at one end and old man feet at the other. Mm-hmm. So if we see them as like a single stick, they might actually look like some weird long centipede of hands or something, or maybe they're connected in different ways so that they form like a giant snake tentacle thing.
I would like to imagine that they look like a man in a furry suit. No specific reason as to how or why.
Taken together, if you look at it, you squint a little bit, they look like Abe Lincoln riding a turtle.
Anything you want. It's a book. It's your imagination.
Yeah,
just use it.
Imagination.
Just use it.
Okay. We have the points and we haven't looked at any of them.
Yeah, we've been talking about it because it's a very poignant story.
Yeah, so getting to the actual points we have, because we've just been sort of freeballing it up until now.
Yeah.
There is one thing I wanted to establish, kind of like we established in the last book we met, Gods and Generals, where we were talking about the Confederates, and we're like, yeah, the Confederate generals can still be compelling, they can still do things for good reasons. They weren't necessarily like black and white evil, even if the Confederacy was evil. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of the same thing when you're talking about Dresden. I don't think there's as many people who are like, the people in Dresden were Nazis, they should have been bombed, even though it was mostly like women and children and people like non-soldiers, non-military things. But there are still some people who will be like, they were Germans, therefore they deserve to be slaughtered wholesale.
Yeah, it's
I don't know. Obviously I don't believe that, but I think there are some people who are still like, you know, to them a Nazi is a Nazi, no matter what.
I feel like with any book that we have that has some form of history in it, we have to show that we have some objective realism. Or relativism, sorry.
We have some relativism where we do want to acknowledge, like, yes, Nazism, unequivocally bad. Like a racist, fascist ideology, nationalist, pretty much all the bad ideologies put into one. Don't condone anything about Nazis, but individual people should be judged on what they actually did. Just because someone was in Germany during the 40s, just because they might have supported Nazism very vaguely, doesn't mean they deserve to be flash fried.
Even the people that are walking down the street and saying terrible things, yes, they should be corrected and should be shown that they have not, what they're thinking is completely wrong, but those who did not do any acts of actual evil,
yeah,
I feel like they should be given the chance to do that. It's not as cut and dry, essentially.
As I say, you've got to judge people on an individual basis, and when it comes to a city with 135,000 people, you can't really you can't just like bomb all of them and be like, they were all probably evil.
No, but that Ted guy, I feel like they could have carpet bombed
there was probably one or two evil people. To be fair, I mean, probably 10% of all people are evil, maybe.
Let's not go for a statistic on this.
I mean, even then, I don't know. If someone's evil, but they're just sort of like an evil baker.
I have used... This is where the gluten-free stuff comes, isn't it?
They're just like, I have made very passive-aggressively bad cakes. I don't think that person deserves to be bombed.
No, not really, no.
Probably not.
I feel like there's very few people that deserve to be bombed.
Hardleg is anti-massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And I think 99%... I'm trying to think if there's any situation where I would be like, you know what, a massacre had to be done. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
When I massacred all those cookies, they deserved to die.
They deserve to be eaten.
They were evil cookies, and I brought justice to them.
But yeah, we just wanted to get that out of the way. You know, we think the bombing of Dresden was bad.
Mm-hmm.
Comment in the comments if you disagree. I can't imagine many people do, but we wanted to establish that before we got into basically the weirdest thing to me about this book, because you, as we mentioned before, didn't really care much for this book. And I think you're the first person I've ever met who was like, I don't really like Billy Pilgrim. I don't like the journey. I wasn't invested. It took me a while to get through it.
Yeah, for me, it was a perfect storm of, like we said earlier, that the James Franco audiobook version wasn't that great. It does it in such a monotone way that it made me have this overarching malaise to it that made it feel like the book itself wasn't even attempting to take things seriously, or even seriously or jokingly. It was just this very...
It was so casual and so dry the whole time that it didn't seem like anything had any emphasis or importance.
It felt like reading the phone book, essentially.
Everything was so it goes.
And so it goes. And then on top of that, the fact that Billy Pilgrim has... he is this very unassuming character, but in his unassumption, he does several little things that trigger me to be kind of pissed off at him. In two separate occasions, one we'll get into later that might be possibly fabricated in his own mind, and in actuality, there is one time where he actually cheats on his wife, and that's one of the first times you slide through time with him. I'm not a big fan of that, on top of the fact that how he describes, or how the book itself describes the relationship, or the actual understanding of how Billy Pilgrim feels about his wife. With his wife, he describes her immediately as both ugly and fat, and doesn't really do much more than just berate her mentally in his own mind. Other than that, his actual actions are decent and of a decent man.
Yeah, he's really nice to her, but he's like, yeah, she just likes diamonds and pretty shiny things, so I give it to her. And she likes to be doted on, so I say nice things to her.
And he also constantly talks about her eating habit, which is not cool. And then on top of that, he did the way that the book describes his relationship with Montana Wallhack, which is either, if depending on how you read it.
Either way, just she's the porn star in the Tralfalmadorian Zoo that he's trapped in there with her.
And the ways he describes this with her is very much like...
It's like how beautiful and lovely she is, and how amazing, and they're made for each other.
And they have actual moments of like intimacy in the story, which kind of, again, rubs me the wrong way in the sense that it's just this very...
Yeah, where it's like when he's with his wife and he's like... She asks him how it was in the war, and he just like, I guess she wants to know, so he just tells her what she wants to hear.
But with Montana, it's very intimate, and it feels very much like there's a relationship there.
Yeah. He doesn't, with his wife, he sort of just tells her like the facts, like I was in a POW camp, this happened, that happened. And with Montana, he sort of talks about how he felt about it.
On top of the fact that like, they both reach out to him, in a sense, and... he is more receptive to Montana, which is, again, this does not rub me the right way on that.
Yeah. It's just weird because everyone else I know who've read this book, like, no one really gets invested in, like, Billy Pilgrim's character. He's not really set up as, like, a protagonist that's right or a protagonist that you want to emulate or anything. He's just sort of set up like, this is a guy, this is his life, this are the things that he went through. And so it's like when he cheats on his wife, it's not like the book is saying that thing's good or that thing's bad. It's just like one more event in his life along with a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, but it just doesn't make me endeared to the character. And I know that that's not the big issue on that, but it's also the main narrative structure of it. So it kind of breaks down for me. It
is one of those interesting things where like, I remember when you first like sort of described this to me, and part of me wanted to be like, you know, this is an artsy book, like, it's not about the characters, you gotta look beyond them, and I'm like, I don't know how to say that without sounding pretentious. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you do have a good point, like, the story should, at its core, be enjoyable, the characters should be enjoyable, And I'm wondering why it was so easy for me to just sort of like glance over that while you were like stuck on his character. Like, why doesn't it mean anything to me? And despite all this time I have thinking, I haven't been able to come up with anything. I'd be interested if people could say down in the comments or whatever. Because I'm not sure if it feels like it is actually a flaw, if there's something that, like, he did that just worked on me and didn't work on Brandon.
But admittedly, that would have made this book completely unbearable to me had there not been this one part at the very end where it talks about this teacher that is destined to die throughout the entire book, stands up and gives this rousing speech, and Kurt Vonnegut literally breaks the story for a second and says, now, he was a character at this moment. He was being a very character-based person. And then no one else in this story is. And everyone else in this movie is kind of just, in this book, is kind of just like floundering around and just like flopping around. And no one in this book is very much a character. And that's the way I wrote it. And to me, that was just like, wow, that is true. I'm glad you said this. If you hadn't, I would have hated you. Yeah. I would have hated this story.
I guess that's the thing about Billy, is that, like, it feels so realistic in the sense that, like, he's just a flawed guy. Like, he's so realistic. I can't attribute any, like, meaning to his actions. Like, I don't think there's a reason, like, why he cheats on his wife. It's just something, like, he decided to do, and maybe I don't agree with it.
It's kind of like how his wife dies. It's very drawn out, but it's not, like, disastrous. It's just like this,
this bad thing happened, yeah.
So it goes.
Yeah, what was it? He was in a airplane crash, and then she was driving to the hospital and was very excited, got in a crash of her own, and the crash didn't kill her, but it, like, broke the line on her. Like, she crashed into someone and then just basically backed up. It was like, I'm sorry, I gotta go to the hospital, and kept going. And carbon monoxide was leaking into the car. And by the time she got to the hospital, she just passed out and died.
Yeah, it was...
It's this very, like, non-Hollywood, non-storybook ending where it's like, oh, that was really weird.
Mm-hmm. It's a very human death, because she's so in hysterics that she's, like... that her husband is alive but also in a coma and they don't know what's... It's just so distraught.
One of those things... It always reminds me of when you talk about, like, carbon monoxide, because carbon monoxide is such, like, a silent, sudden killer that doesn't have any, like, narrative weight to it. Weird Al's parents actually both died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Huh. And it was just, like, some freak accident with, like, their piping where, like, a little crack just opened up in it, and then just one day they went to bed and they died.
Yeah, I mean,
and you just found out, they just checked on them a few days later and like, oh, it smells like gas in here, and they never knew because they were passed out. It's just so weird when you try to think of your life as like a narrative arc where like, you do all these things, you do that, and one day, for no reason whatsoever, you just go to sleep and die. Mm-hmm. And it's again, it makes it feel very realistic, this very human, almost like insignificance, where you gotta like make do with what you got.
I actually see that as kind of a blessing, because I've seen enough deaths that are terrible.
Yeah,
I don't mind the idea of going to bed and then waking up. I do feel sad for the people left behind, but that's...
Yeah, well, obviously there's a lot worse ways to die. Mm-hmm. But it's just one of those things, like the suddenness of it, the sudden and the randomness of it almost, where it's just like, you like to believe that, like, you die surrounded by your friends, or maybe you make a reckless mistake and that ends your life, or something. It's just weird to think that, like, it was a Tuesday and this thing that I wasn't aware of just happened to kill me.
I'm fully planning on going out like Elvis, taking a dump so hard that my heart can't take it.
Just your brain, your entire brain.
Just gonna shit out my brain.
But yeah, that's I guess your interesting point. That's the discussion point I'm curious about people in the comments. Like, if you've read this book, or if you do read this book after hearing this, could you get invested in Billy's character? Did you find Billy annoying? And did that affect your view of the book? Do you think the fact that Billy is not a very compelling character makes the book worse? Would it have been better if they made him slightly more interesting?
Yeah, but it is emphasized that most of the other characters that are around him are just rancid people.
A lot of them, yeah. I mean, he looks a lot better compared to the guy who, like, killed that dog for almost no reason.
I don't remember the killing the dog. I do remember the...
It's the same guy who kills him in the future.
Oh, yeah.
Where he was just like, no one fucks with me. You fuck with me and you end up paying the price.
I was talking about that guy's friend, where he's just like, you know what a blood gutter is?
Yeah.
I'm gonna tell you what that is. Like, that dude just like, I felt gross listening about that dude.
Oh, yeah, the guy who died of gangrene?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I felt bad for him, because that's a pretty horrible way of dying.
But he was like, my dad's got a collection of knives. I got all the best. I came to war prepared. Me and these 2 scouts were the 3 musketeers. You're just dragging us down, Billy.
Yeah, just, I don't know.
Such an asshole.
There's a lot of characters that you could simultaneously see as just terrible and feel bad for them.
And I forget the school teacher guy, the guy who stands up, and he was the one who then stole a teapot, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone was looting what was left of Dresden, if they found stuff. But for whatever reason, the guards just like saw him taking a teapot, and they were like, no, he has to be punished. The firing squad.
And it's just like, that's dumb, so it goes.
Yeah, so it goes. It's one of just those random things.
Mm-hmm. But on to the next point. Were the Tralfamadorians Billy actual, like, real, or were they like a PTSD thing?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest like discussion points in this. Because after we were done reading it, I started looking up different like YouTube vids discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
Crash Course actually made a really good one, like a 2-part video.
They do a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, but
why are you even watching us? Go to Crash Course.
They could say everything in like 10 minutes. But yeah, they had a 2-part episode on their literature course about Slaughterhouse-Five, talking about different elements of it. And one of the things that was interesting, to them, the Tralfamadorians aren't real.
Yeah.
The aliens aren't real. Kurt Vonnegut is not trying to say that time is non-linear, that everything that will happen has happened and you have no free will. It's just what it is. What he's saying is Billy Pilgrim has PTSD from surviving this horrific event.
Hardcore.
That was perpetrated by the good guys. Like, he went home and became a successful optometrist, and people are praising him, and all he did in the war was, like, hide and then get bombed by his own people and watch people get slaughtered. And the only way he could sort of rationalize that, the only way that it sits right in his mind, is if we don't have free will. Like, if he didn't have any choice in what happened, if his life is just everything happened and so it goes, then he can live with himself. He's happy with himself because he knows nothing he could have done would have made a difference.
As coping mechanisms go, it's kind of intricate and it's really interesting. The only parts that really kind of threw me the most was the 1970s zappy guns thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where they talk about him in the future.
Yeah, I'm just like, I can believe aliens. I can believe,
Well, I mean, to be fair, if something in the 50s is like, this happens in the future, and like the way future of the 1980s or the 1990s, and it's, what was it, or like the America has been split into like 9 different countries, and Billy is a big celebrity, and they gets assassinated with a laser gun.
I'm still waiting on the angels from Neon Genesis Evangelion happening, because it's still
just coming down. First Impact.
First Impact still hasn't happened yet.
I got my brick.
But yeah, it's a really interesting way to look at it, and I kind of actually lean towards that simply because it makes the idea, this story of Billy Pilgrim, much more tragic and much more interesting and much more compelling to me, but it doesn't also make me forgive some of the other things in there.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, on the one hand, if you wanted a science fiction story, it kind of lessens it to think that it's all in his head, and it also kind of messes up, like, where in the timeline does the story actually take place? Because if you assume that, like, yeah, the Tralfamadorian stuff is fake and he's just on, like, linear time, is it him in the hospital and after the plane crash where he's got that head wound and he's thinking about, like, the stuff that happened back in the past, and he's fantasizing about this future where he's famous for telling people about the aliens or whatever? Or is it like, is this in the war and he's fantasizing, like, even the optometrist stuff is fake, or it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's hard to say, hard to leg, because...
Well, I guess it would have to be after the war, otherwise he wouldn't have PTSD to begin with.
I like to think that everything between him becoming unstuck in time and the end of the book is all hallucination. Not obviously not the real stuff, but like anything in between there. just this idea of, because he starts off the book by saying like he knows how it ends, obviously, because he wrote it. And it's just kind of poignant how he starts it off with, crap, I can't remember the first line, but I remember the end line because it's pooty wheat.
The first line in at least the second chapter after he explains everything.
After we get all that stuff done.
Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. He has gone to sleep a senile widowmaker and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He has gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times. He says and pays random visits to all these events in between.
Yeah, it kind of gives me this feeling that, like, everything between him leaning on that tree in 1942 or 41 or whatever.
Yeah, at the end of the war, so I think 42.
42, to when he's laying there in the coach, looking up into the sky and just feeling the sun on his face. I feel like everything in between there is just the random garblings of a man who doesn't really... Because the character of Billy Pilgrim doesn't really understand the idea of war.
The interesting thing about this is that the term PTSD didn't exist when this book was written.
Yes.
It was shell shock still.
Yeah.
And they didn't really understand the complete ramifications of it and everything. So a lot of this stuff is sort of like...
hearsay.
Yeah. And it I don't know, again, it's really interesting to see these, like, before there was a term for it, he sort of explained how it felt.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that John Green points out again when he does it is... like, having PTSD feels like being unstuck in time, because even though you're in the present, you keep going back to 1941, you keep going back to being in that prison camp, to being in the slaughterhouse, and, like, hearing the bombs and stuff like that. It's like, no matter what you try to do to move beyond it, you keep getting dragged back to relive that experience over and over again.
And it's kind of unrelated, but very much unrelated. It kind of reminds me of... a scene in Daredevil, the TV show, season 2. They introduce the Punisher and talk about how he, during the Punisher's backstory, his entire family gets killed and he gets shot. And it talks about how the bullet lodged in his brain and actually kept him literally reliving the emotional state of that experience every moment of every day, and that he could not escape it. It was just like always firing back to that memory.
I'm not sure bullets work that way. But
it's a good representation, I'd say.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know, that's kind of what makes Billy, like, again, it's, the great thing about this book is, you know, you're reading it and it's like, he jumps here, he jumps there, he tells stuff, and then afterwards, like, you think about it, where it's like, if he's laying in this hospital and he just keeps flashing back to the war and he keeps, like, you know, things get really dark, so he just tries to think about this beautiful future. Like, what if he was somewhere where he didn't have to worry about all this? What if he just had a beautiful woman who loved him? And I'm just like, that poor guy. Yeah. Like, he's such, he's so broken. And I feel sad for him.
At points, yeah, I do. But then there's also points where he talks about being happy, where he's just financially sound.
Yeah.
And that's all he wanted, and he marries a woman simply for that fact. And I'm just kind of like,
I mean, I like money.
I like money too, but it's not the only thing in life, and it's, yeah.
Yeah. Although he becomes sort of, like, disenfranchised with it, obviously, over time.
Yeah.
Just the older he gets, the more and more. Well, that could also be why, like, the aliens visit him, like, in his 40s or whatever. Because the older he gets, the more it sort of weighs on him. Or maybe it's just as he gets older, his mind sort of breaks down a little bit. Hard to say.
Or just at 40, he was like, why don't I just get abducted by aliens and bang a porn star?
Yeah.
That would be great.
He just read too many Kilgore Trout books is what it
was. For me, I know, until you told me that he's a character that that comes through in different stories for Kurt Vonnegut, I thought Kilgore Trout was a kind of a jab at himself.
Yeah, well, he's never written a whole bunch of science fiction stuff as far as I know. But yeah, Kilgore Trout in this book is a science fiction author that Billy Pilgrim likes, but everyone else hates. Mm-hmm. He says he has really good ideas, but he doesn't know how to capitalize on them.
Somehow he's the guy from Oliver Twist at the same time. I don't know how he has, like, he writes a crap load of stories, and then he runs Newsies / Oliver Twist gang of small children and bullies them into doing his routes. It's weird.
He meets them later on, and apparently there's... In
I want a story about
there's
that guy.
There's an extended Kurt Vonnegut universe where all his
Vonneverse?
not in all of his stories, but in many of his stories, Kilgore Trout is as a character that they meet. There's also like an American Nazi in this that comes as a recurring character, and a couple other things that are like mentioned here. And of course, Kurt Vonnegut appears in several more of his stories.
Mm-hmm.
I think famously, I haven't read Breakfast of Champions, but I've heard the climax of that story is Kurt Vonnegut shows up and talks to the main character.
It's just, wow. I think my favorite part for Kurt Vonnegut, though, in this book is when he sees Dresden, and he's like, it's like Oz. And that immediately made me wish that the city had not been bombed. To the point where I was like, what does this city look like?
I mean, we could look at, I think there might have been some, like, pictures before the bombing. If you want to see Dresden...
It's just going to pop up with Dresden
before the war. Yeah, just the architecture. Yeah, there's a before and after.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Like I said, he describes it as being like the moon. There's just minerals. There's rocks and no wood or life or anything.
And yeah, no, like we're looking at pictures now, and
look at Dresden before and after the bombing.
It is a heartbreaking thing.
You see, like you hear about a city, and then it's not until you see it from the distance that you realize just how huge it is. But then also, like, this city was like
architecture.
The architecture is just like amazing. The giant towers and the soaring, like, what was it? We were speaking about Kilgore Trout a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what you thought. They had a couple asides about Kilgore stories, and they had one specifically.
The Jesus one?
The Jesus one. I was curious what you thought about that.
That was another gut punch that I was kind of like, I don't like this story. It's just...
I don't know. It's one of those things, like, I think the concept is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Where he's like, what was it? Where basically the alien rewrites the Bible.
Yeah.
And he makes it so that instead of Jesus being born the Son of God, he's just a man who is really nice and lived. And then when people kill him, God says, I'm adopting this man because he's so holy. He's my son now.
We're literally discussing the topic of Buddha.
Is that Buddha?
Well, I mean, sort of. But it's more along the lines of a man became God in that story. And it's a very...
Yeah.
I'm talking about, but I don't have enough theology at the moment to describe to you on that. But
yeah, just want obviously it's like sacrilegious, or what would be the word?
Sacrilegious is the correct term.
Okay, yeah, it's sacrilegious, but I like the idea that like you should be nice to people because everyone is like the son of God.
To be honest, it literally misses the entire point of Jesus being born as both man and God, because it was the idea that God saw that man could not fulfill the own requirements of his own covenant, so he sent his only son down as man to be tempted by all the things that man has been tempted by, and to come out on top of the fact that he would also sacrifice himself, fulfilling the contract of Abraham, of Moses, and of Jacob, to fulfill the actual requirements of a millennia long contract or covenant with him, so that it would bring about the salvation. It kind of bypasses the idea of the importance of God being both fully man and fully God, and says, well, he was just a dude who was really nice. Like, no, he was more than that. And it kind of...
Well, see, that's the thing to me, is like, when I look to the Bible, or when I used to look to the Bible, it was for inspiration. It was for things to sort of, like, teach me how to act. And so, like, the idea that God would send his son down and have him go through these trials and then sacrifice himself, like, I appreciate that God would do that for me. But to me, it's more inspiring the idea that, like, God would want us to be good, that we have the ability to be that holy, that it's not like we are the lesser and this guy can only resist the temptations because he's part God.
But that's what the definition of holy is to be set apart. And to realize that God is set apart and he is holy and we are apart from him. So he put himself into the form of man to show the set apartness.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that not so much that man can strive for that, because that is an impossibility.
It's impossible, but I thought that was the point, is we should strive to be like that.
We should.
He was an example.
It was more to the point that we could strive for it. We're never going to accomplish it. And so thus...
Yeah, I think that's the thing that gets me, is that, like, because he's divine, because we can never accomplish that, it's sort of like, I don't know, it kind of lessens it for me.
Why do you make art?
To express myself. To sort of tell people other ideas and things.
But you're never going to make something that's the most perfect expression of yourself.
I might be able to.
Will you?
I have hope that I can. It's
and
a like 0.001% chance, but there is hope. And that's what I'm saying. Like, if you imagine that there was a perfect person and God adopted them, that makes you believe, like, yes, it's nigh impossible, but it is still possible.
Honestly, there actually was. His name was Enoch. It's really awesome.
Yeah. Either way, we don't want to get into a big theological thing. I thought that was an interesting little aside, and I was curious to see what your views on it were.
Enoch wasn't perfect. Yeah, but my views on that story is that is, like I said, it was very much missing the point, which was another one of those parts that kind of took me from being like, I like this book, to being like,
To me, again, I thought you would see it as the same as like every Kilgore Trout story. That's kind of an interesting idea, but it's not executed well at all.
Yeah, no, that's...
Because I believe if they made a story that didn't involve Jesus, just about a guy who was really, really good, and then, like, you know, not Jesus, but someone was really, really good, and then, like, divine providence shone down and was like, you did a really good job, so I'm going to save you, or I'm going to, like, note that you were special in some way. Like, I think you would like that story.
Literally any good story involving a cleric in D&D.
Yeah.
Or paladin.
It's like, it was an interesting idea. It's just the fact that he made it about Jesus kind of, like, altered it.
It kind of takes the idea and tries to draw it to a parallel that he clearly didn't have the full faculties of.
Yeah. The story has a lot of weird little asides like that.
Yeah, that was another one of the parts that kind of threw me, is that his descriptions, I know narrative-wise it makes sense, but it kind of just, he over-describes things that didn't involve the story.
Yeah. Like,
I mean, describing the city of Dresden as being like the moon is very good, very beautiful. But then he was like talking about the people that captured him, that captured Billy Pilgrim, and he went on for like 5 or 6 paragraphs describing these guys, and I'm just like, I don't care.
I think the point was to show that, like, the first chapter talks about he wants to make this war story, and then he goes to talk to an old war buddy, and that buddy's wife gets, like, really angry because she's
just
like,
babies.
Yeah. She thinks he's going to write this book about the war where big heroic men go off and fight and do their duty and are tough, and it's going to inspire people. It was written about the 60s, so you have Korea and Vietnam, which are these very not obviously right and wrong sort of conflicts where people were being sent to die in horrible ways, and a lot of them were going thinking they were going to be like the soldiers in World War II. There are a lot of people who thinking, this is going to be a heroic thing, I'm going to do that, and they didn't know they would be, like, burning down villages with flamethrowers and napalm.
This is the beginning of the disillusion of the glory of war.
Yeah. And so she's really upset that, like, you're going to write this book about World War II, and it's going to inspire people to think that war is glorious. And he assured her that it would not be glorious in anything. So that's why it takes the story of Billy Pilgrim, who is a chaplain's assistant, carries no gun to the entire thing, is kind of a bumbling buffoon, who is then, like, forced to wear a mismatched shoes and a women's dress. Not a dress, women's coat.
Yeah.
And, like, the people who capture him are, like, a 14-year-old German and 2 really old guys with, like, 1 gun between them, and then a dog that's, like, more scared of them than they are of it.
Yeah. 2 things about that, though. First off, if I were to make this movie, I would have gotten Frank Sinatra to play that character. Just to spite the book. Just to spite it, just for that. And second off, little trivia for you guys on the other side. I wanted to be a chaplain's assistant myself.
Hey.
Yeah. When I attempted to get into the military, I wanted to check out the chaplain's assistant's job. And my grandfather was actually a chaplain's assistant. And all he did was just drive around people. He didn't get to carry a gun either. So
yeah. And that's what I'm saying. They tried to make it into something where like Billy is not a warrior, and the people he fights against are not like these what you would typically think of like these brave warriors. When he gets stopped by people, the reason why he goes so in depth into how these German soldiers look is because he doesn't want you to imagine them to be like the square-faced Nazis with their dark eyes and the swastikas. Like, no, it's a farm boy and 2 old guys with a dog and a shotgun.
Now I'm picturing some Bond villain-like character with, like, swastika contacts.
Swastika eyes! Da-da-da-da! Okay, but yeah, moving on. Final point we got here, or close to the final point. One of the things that really kind of threw me for this book, because like you said, it ends with a bird just going pooty wheat.
Which I kind of thought was nice, because that was the only part that frickin' Franco made sound fun, where he had an inflection for pooty wheat, and
Pooty wheat.
you actually felt for something on them, like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Because it just then he's like, after a massacre, there is no big speeches. There's just the birds chirping in the silence.
Yeah.
Who are unconcerned with what's going on, who don't really seem to realize it. And, but that's the thing is, like, it doesn't, I've long maintained that the way the story ends, I've long maintained that the way a story ends determines its message. I think I always use the example of, A Clockwork Orange. I forget, have I told you this on the podcast before?
You've not told me how it ends, no.
Okay. So I guess spoilers for A Clockwork Orange if you ever want to read that. But the interesting thing about it, there's the original British version, and then there's the American version. And in the American version, they took off the last chapter because they didn't like the ending, and it completely changes
the outlook
of the story. Because the Clockwork Orange is about a man who is like unambiguously evil, and then the government puts him in this program where they classically condition him to where if he thinks like a violent thought or does anything violent, he becomes very, very ill.
Yeah.
And they're like, they're like, look, we've cured him. We've made him into a productive member of society.
Basically brainwash him.
They basically brainwash him. But then it gets to the point where like, then he's trying to like just go down the street and do his job. And he gets confronted by like 2 people half his age, and they just like beat the crap out of him. And he's literally incapable of defending himself because the idea of fighting makes him ill. He gets hit, and the sight of his own blood, like, makes him sick.
Yeah.
And so, like, they're like, you've made him helpless. Like, you've completely, declawed him to the point that he's not even a human anymore. He's just like a machine. So they have to deprogram him. And the American version of the story ends with he's deprogrammed, and he decides to go back out and rejoin his gang. And the moral of the story seems to be, like, human nature is human nature. You've got to let the bad people be evil. You can't change them because it's more wrong to change them than to just, like, let them be evil.
Yeah.
Which is like, I'm not sure if I really agree about that. That just sort of seems weird. Like, yeah, some people are just evil. You shouldn't try to convince their mind or whatever. You should just kill the evil people, I guess.
And wear a lot of eyeliner.
Yeah. But the British version has one more chapter after that takes place like 5 or 6 years later, where he's part of he was part of this gang, but his one gang member disappeared, the other one's in jail for life, and the other one, like, died. And then he runs into the one that disappeared at, like, a bar, and he's sitting there with his wife, where he's like, yeah, I stopped doing that, I went back to school, like, I met this woman, like, we're gonna have a kid soon. And he basically just, like, settled down. And the main character is like, well, fuck, I'm getting, like, older. I can't just keep running around like this. Maybe I should try to do something with my life. Maybe I should try to settle down. And then he has this thought. He's like, but if I have, like, a kid and he's a teenager, he's going to be just as reckless and crazy as I was. He might be worse than me. He might get himself killed like my friend. He's like, but what am I going to do about that? Like, you've kind of just got to let them be wild.
Let them eat cake.
That's not the right sentiment. That's a completely different thing. But yeah, the British version is much more looking at teenagers, because there's always this moral panic about kids these days. Yeah. And realizing, like, yeah, when you were a kid, you were reckless and crazy too. You did some crazy shit. Maybe not as crazy as Alex in A Clockwork Orange. You weren't a rapist and a murderer, hopefully. But it's just the idea that, like, we all go through a wild phase. and you can't try to force them to be perfect, because otherwise you're going to make a bunch of people who are like emotionally damaged.
Yeah, you can't stop people from being stupid in their younger days.
Yeah, but like, because you kept that chapter out, it's the difference between some people are born evil and some people go through like a phase where they're reckless and crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes more about teenagers than it becomes about the duality of man. And I feel like the teenager is a little bit more like understandable. Like, they're going to be reckless, try to have a hand on them, but you can't force them not to live their lives.
And the point he's trying to make here is that really the ending of a story really does draw it all together.
And yeah, you know, if you take that to its logical conclusion, if you had taken out 3 more chapters and ended after they conditioned him, then the moral of the story is like, oh, you can change people for the better using science.
Mm-hmm.
Like, depending on where you end a story, it completely changes the message of it. So yeah, kind of a long story, but my point is there's a lot of stories like that where the ending really hammers home. The thing about Kurt Vonnegut's book, the thing about Slaughterhouse-Five, is that the ending literally is just like, there's nothing there. A bird says pooty wheat.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing, there's no significance to it other than it's just the calm after the storm. And even then, that's not like the ending of Billy's life, because you've been going back and forth. The non-linear way the narrative is told makes it so you know that isn't the real end. There's like multiple ends, depending on how you want to look at it. Technically, nothing ever ends, because life is just all there, and you can travel back and forth between it at any time.
It's a very Tralfamadorian book, because it's just a bunch of snippets of Billy Pilgrim's life stacked onto each other and said, hey, here's a pretty picture.
Yeah, they mention specifically, let me see if I can look up the exact quote. I have it saved here somewhere. Okay, yeah, here's where it talks about Tralfamadorian literature. Like, Billy couldn't read Tralfamadorian, of course, but he could at least see how the books were laid out, in brief clumps of symbols separated by stars. Each clump of symbols is a brief, urgent message describing a situation, a scene. We Tralfamadorians read them all at once, not one after another. There isn't any particular relationship between all the messages, except that the author has chosen them carefully, so that, when seen all at once, they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths and many marvelous moments seen all at once. And yeah, that's, again, with this whole, the way this book is laid out, not only the non-linear way of it, but the fact that while you're reading it, it's kind of, and then taken all at once at the end.
It's very, yeah.
Then it has the impact. It's this very interesting, I almost kind of want to see it explored more, but I wonder if done by a lesser author, if it would be completely unbearable to me.
Yeah.
Like, if you had a longer book than this short thing, I'm not sure I would be able to put up with the whole thing.
Turns out Wheel of Time ends with pooty wheat. Sorry, I had to spoil that for you on that.
No! A memory of light! Pooty wheat!
It is a Wheel of Time. Though I have to put this out there. Is it not a little bit arrogant for the Tralfamadorians to actually imply that their works are all automatically deep in hard quotes?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things too. Is
And also beautiful.
When some people, when you interpret this book, they're again the people who take the Tralfamadorians literally, sort of see them as maybe that's what Kurt Vonnegut is pushing. Like, they're right because Billy agrees with them and he's the main character.
Mm-hmm.
And if taken that way, you could almost see of them as being, like, just as arrogant as, like, Americans are about other things. Like, oh, we're right. Oh, this is how it is. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. We're more advanced than you, and therefore we know everything.
But we are. God bless the USA.
Yeah. Just, oh.
From sea to shining sea.
I can't even joke about it right now just because of all the stuff in the news. I don't even want to get into it.
Yeah, fair point.
It's so depressing. Oh, but anyway.
On that point,
I think, well, we did have one question from someone. We did actually have someone bring up a topic on the Discord.
Thank you.
Which, a reminder, if you join the Hardleg Patreon, we have a Discord for Legs Talk About Books. We'll give you updates on the books that we're reading. You can submit questions. We have discussions there. We only had one guy who really read it was Mar with a bunch of R's. and they asked us to talk about the thoughts on the fourth wall breaks. Says, I know it's kind of tame by 21st century standards, but I feel like a sort of meta screw was relatively unheard of or even frowned upon in quote-unquote serious fiction for most of literary history, and doesn't have any implications on the story. And I was going to talk about that, but I think we really talked about that in the early parts of the book.
Yeah, it's...
it was really different for the time, especially for, a serious war book to have aliens and time jumping and fourth wall breaks.
And I actually didn't know about this comment. I'm actually pretty glad that you brought it in, because we already, like we said, we already talked about it. And definitely, if you have any more questions, we are definitely up for hearing it.
We're always up. Hopefully we can get... Next time, though, on Legs Talk About Books, we'll be doing something much, much more light. Something with a lot more levity.
A little bit more hope.
A little, not even hope, but just we just did the Civil War book, and then after that we did the World War II book. Now we're going to something that's just completely fantasy, has nothing to do with any real world things, and that is the New Spring, the novel.
We're doing it in summer for some odd reason, though.
Yeah, which is the prequel to the Wheel of Time series. Because Wheel of Time, I started reading this, and Brandon was going to pick, it's his turn to pick a book. And we talked about it a while, and you didn't really have anything in mind, did you?
Not at the moment. That might be if you let me do next week, because this is around your story. But
yeah, I wasn't planning on doing one for this, but I started reading it. I'm 100 pages in, and I was really struck by, compared to all the other Wheel of Time stories, this is fairly self-contained. Mm-hmm. If you know who Moraine is, and the White Tower, and who Lan is, then you can understand this book. It doesn't require you to read all the other ones. It doesn't have anything to do with all the other ones. So who knows? Maybe like with 3, this might be a good starting point to come in.
We'll see, yeah.
We'll see. Either way, it's supposed to be a fantasy adventure, so maybe you'll enjoy it. You were actually going to try to read this one, right?
I'm going to try and read it. It turns out it's not fantasy. It's about driving a sedan down the highway.
I will admit, there is a surprising amount of paperwork in the first couple chapters.
You have to fill out the paperwork to get to the book. It's just...
No, but they do a lot of paperwork in it, but it's for a cause. There's a mystery that needs to be solved. So it's more interesting than it says.
Or are they going to rewrite history because they're DuckTales? Ooh.
No. No, Brandon, there's not DuckTales. There are no ducks in this story.
Sorry, it's what my brain immediately thinks of.
Either way, yeah, we'll be doing that next time, and I think the time after that, I've already got something scheduled.
All right,
I'll tell you when we get, but what we can get you, you'll get a story eventually at some point.
I figured.
Okay, so yeah, make sure you check that out if you want to join us next time. New Spring fantasy novel, join in on the Wheel of Time. It's one of the shorter ones, more self-contained. Should be interesting. Give us something to talk about that's more fun. Let us know what you thought about this, though. Maybe you'd like to see more classic. I think this is the first classic novel we've read.
It's one of the first actual high literature.
Yeah,
the things that you're not going to be told to read Wheel of Time in school for class, but you will be told to read Slaughterhouse-Five, even though I never got to it. So
yeah. Okay, we'll see. Maybe you'd like to see more Kurt Vonnegut. We can do Breakfast of Champions or Cat's Cradle or something. I've heard those are really, really good. Mm-hmm. Or we could just do more literary classics, something I never read Fahrenheit 451. Have you?
Neither have I. No.
Yeah, we might try something like that. Maybe another dystopian thing, something with a little sci-fi element that's still a literary classic.
We could read some form of To Kill a Mockingbird or something that's actually
I don't think I want to. There's not much you could say about To Kill a Mockingbird at this point that hasn't already been said.
I mean, there are no mockingbirds.
Brave New World.
Yeah, well, you could do that too.
I've read that before. That one's got a lot of sex in it, though. I'm not sure if you'll like it.
I have known about it. I'm not a big idea, but yeah.
Or 1984.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dystopian ones we could look at.
There's some Philip K. Dick we could check out too, so yeah. Yeah,
we'll see. Either way, thanks for catching with us. Thanks for chilling out. Remember to keep reading. Donate to the Patreon. And if you're ever in Cody, Wyoming, ask for Wild Bob.
Putty wheat.